Hi, my name is Dr. Meese, and I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga. And I'm here, and that's where I want all of you to come to college when you get old enough, because when you get to college, you get to do lots of fun stuff, like walk around outside like I'm doing. But the truth is, you can do that now. But I'm walking around outside today, and it's a day in the wintertime because I want to show you some things about some of the trees that we have here where I live in Chattanooga. So I'm looking down the hillside into a little valley, and I can see that in the wintertime, most of these trees have lost their leaves. These trees are deciduous trees. That means that the leaves fell in the fall, and in the wintertime, we don't see those leaves. But if you look really carefully, right through there, I can see some green still. And that's because that tree down there, that pine tree, is a conifer. And it still has green needles that didn't fall down. So those are pretty big words. Deciduous, deciduous, and conifer. Conifer. Conifer, deciduous. Deciduous. Now, because it's winter time, there are lots of brown and gray and old leaves that are already down on the ground. And here's one. This tree is an oak tree, or this leaf is from an oak tree. It's from an oak tree called a red oak tree. And what I want you to know about this leaf is that it's called deciduous. So oak trees are one kind of deciduous tree. Now look at this little tiny tree. It's a little baby, just started to grow pine tree. And do you see it has these little green needles? And even though all of these leaves from these deciduous trees have fallen down in the wintertime, that little pine tree still has those green needles. And that's because a pine tree is a kind of tree called a conifer. Conifer trees, the needles, they stay green in the wintertime, or for most conifers. And that's why sometimes people call conifers evergreens. And that the winter time is a great time to walk around outside because you can really easily see the difference between the deciduous and the conifer trees. So these trees here are deciduous, but look at that big pine tree. That's a conifer, and right next to it is a deciduous. And look way down at the bottom of the forest, and you can see those little bitty baby pine trees growing, and they're conifers. So there are some great big giant pine trees up above, and then lots of deciduous trees that have lost their leaves. So in the wintertime, it's really easy to tell the difference between the two. Deciduous trees have seeds just like conifers do, and that is an acorn. It fell down from an oak tree. And the oak tree, lots of acorns will fall from the oak tree. And you can imagine a squirrel going around and conifers grow from seeds too. This is a pine cone from the pine tree, and the pine tree seeds are in that pine cone. I wanted to show you this pine tree because you can see the pine cone right there growing right on the pine tree. And that's how the pine tree has a seed. Now, this is kind of interesting. Here is a deciduous tree that fell down and it fell across the trail. And so now you can get a really close-up view of the bark on that deciduous tree. Now, this is a conifer. It is a big pine tree, and it fell down in a storm. And the park rangers cut the middle so that people could still walk on this trail and not be blocked. And that gives us a chance to look right inside. You can see there are the needles going out through there. We can look right inside this part of the pine tree, and you can see how the conifer has bark, and it's kind of scratched off right there, so you can kind of see underneath that bark. And if you can see each of these rings, you can think of those as a year, the 4 seasons of that year that this tree has grown. And so we could count all of these rings and see how many seasons or years old this tree is. And right here in the middle, these are the oldest parts of the tree. This is where the tree first started as one of these little baby trees. And every year it grew another ring and grew bigger and bigger. And as it was growing bigger, it grew taller. And if you look closely at the rings, you can see that some are more wide and some are more narrow. So for example, right here is some very narrow parts, and these parts are more wide. And so maybe some years where it's more wide, there may have been more rain. In years where the rings are very thin, it may have been more dry. Like up through here, there may have been a drought, or it may have just been a very dry time, or maybe there wasn't a way to get sunlight. But something caused that tree that year to grow less. And you can also see, do you see how this is darker and this is lighter? This lighter is called the heartwood. This darker is called the sapwood. And there's another little layer right under that bark there. So you can see these different groups by the color. And you can see all those rings. I just wanted you to know that deciduous trees have the same kind of rings too. Now we could call this deciduous tree hardwood, and that pine tree, that conifer I showed you a minute ago, was softwood. But these deciduous trees, they have rings just like the conifers do. So that's something they have in common. The main kinds of conifer trees you might see are pine trees, cedar trees, and spruce trees. And here in Hamilton County, we have this very special kind of tree that's called a hemlock tree. And our hemlock trees are conifer trees. Now, here is a tree that's a conifer. It's not like those trees, it's an evergreen. It's green while the deciduous trees aren't, or those deciduous trees aren't. But if you look at the branches here, it's not needles like on a pine tree, and it's a little different than that hemlock tree too. This is a conifer tree, but it's not a pine tree. This is a cedar tree. It's a red cedar tree. And these are one of the kinds of conifer trees that we can find here in Chattanooga. So it's evergreen. Here in the wintertime, it's green, while those trees have lost their leaves. Because conifers stay green like these baby pine trees, people usually call them evergreen trees. And that's true for most conifers, but it's also true for a few deciduous trees. And here I am on the side of this hill, and there are a couple of different deciduous type trees right here in Chattanooga that are evergreen. And this is one called mountain laurel. See how green that is right here on this winter day when all the other trees that are green are conifers. The mountain laurel is green too, but it's deciduous. Remember that sometimes we'll call conifers evergreens because conifers do stay green. But remember, there are also some deciduous trees that are evergreen. And here's one that we can find right here in Chattanooga. This is a holly. And the holly stays green even though it's wintertime, and most of the other trees that are still green are conifers. But the holly is deciduous.